My wife made me sign a prenup thinking I was dirt poor. She knew nothing about my $200 million inheritance. My wife smiled as I held the pen, smiling like someone who believed she'd just locked my life into place. Her lawyer had highlighted the no claims section in bright yellow, and the entire room fell silent, waiting for me to crumble. I could have argued. I could have ripped the pages in half. Instead, I signed, so she could believe she'd won. What she didn't know was that I had an appointment the next morning with the attorney managing my family trust, and one final confirmation was all it took to change everything. When that inheritance surfaced, the prenup wouldn't protect her. It would expose her. Before we continue with Jamal's story, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Drop a comment. Are you watching from Seattle, Amsterdam, Kenya, or maybe Berlin? I'd love to know where you're tuning in from around the world. Now let's see how Jamal's quiet confidence is about to change everything. The kitchen light cast a warm glow over the granite countertop, but the atmosphere between Jamal and his wife felt arctic. Naya sat across from him, her manicured fingers drumming against the prenuptial agreement she'd placed before him like a verdict. The papers were thick, official, and highlighted in places that made Jamal's stomach tighten. She'd been planning this moment for weeks, maybe months, and the clinical way she watched him read each line told him everything he needed to know about where he stood in her world. "It's really for both our protection," Naya said, her voice carrying the same tone she used with clients who couldn't afford her premium financial services. "My assets, my practice, the house, everything I've built needs to be secure." She tapped the signature line with her pen, the sound sharp against the silence. "And honestly, Jamal, with your situation, this just makes sense for everyone involved." The word situation hung in the air like an accusation, referring to his landscaping work as if it were a character flaw rather than honest labor. Jamal read through the clauses slowly, his expression calm despite the tightening in his chest. The document was thorough, brutally so. It protected her assets, her future earnings, even her retirement accounts from any claim he might have. There were provisions for spousal support that were laughably minimal, and conditions that essentially painted him as a financial liability rather than a partner. "This clause here," he said quietly, pointing to a section near the bottom, "about respect and transparency in the marriage. I'd like to add an addendum about mutual dignity and open communication." His voice was steady, controlled, carrying none of the anger he felt building inside him. Naya's laugh was soft but dismissive, the kind she reserved for people she considered beneath her professional circle. "Jamal, this is a legal document, not a romance novel. We don't need flowery language about feelings." She leaned forward, her expression shifting to what she probably thought was patient understanding. "Look, I know this might sting a little, but we both know I'm the one taking the real risk here. I have a career, a reputation, clients who trust me with millions. You have your work ethic. That's admirable, but it doesn't change the math." The condescension in her voice was wrapped in concern, making it somehow worse than if she'd been openly cruel. "The math," Jamal repeated, picking up the pen and rolling it between his fingers. He could feel her watching him, waiting for him to argue, to beg, to prove her right about his position in their relationship. Instead, he signed his name with steady strokes, then set the pen down and looked directly into her eyes. "I'll sign this, Naya, but I want that addendum about respect added. Call it my one non-negotiable." There was something in his tone that made her pause, a quiet authority she wasn't used to hearing from him. He wasn't pleading or protesting, he was setting a boundary. "Respect?" Naya's eyebrows rose slightly, and she tilted her head as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Enkazi Madaidukin?" The question came out before she could stop it, revealing more about her mindset than any contract clause could. She immediately softened her expression, but the damage was done. In her mind, he had nothing to bargain with, nothing that gave him the right to make demands. She was doing him a favor by marrying him at all, and this prenup was simply making their arrangement official. The fact that he thought he could negotiate showed how little he understood his place in their dynamic. The restaurant buzzed with the kind of sophisticated energy that came with expense accounts and wine lists longer than most people's grocery receipts. Naya had chosen this place deliberately. Meridian was where her circle gathered to celebrate promotions, close deals, and remind each other of their shared success. Jamal sat quietly beside her at the corner table, watching her colleagues size him up with the practiced efficiency of people who made their living evaluating risk. Their smiles were polite, their questions carefully worded, but their judgment was as transparent as the crystal glasses in front of them. "So Jamal works in landscaping," Naya announced, when the conversation naturally turned to careers, her tone carrying a subtle emphasis that transformed honest work into something apologetic. "He has his own route, very stable, very reliable." The word stable hung in the air with all the enthusiasm of a medical diagnosis, and her colleagues nodded with the kind of understanding reserved for unfortunate circumstances beyond anyone's control. Marcus, Naya's business partner, leaned forward with what he probably thought was genuine interest, asking about seasonal work and weather dependencies in a way that made Jamal's profession sound like a hobby that got out of hand. "That must be grounding," said Elena, another financial advisor, her smile bright enough to power the restaurant's mood lighting. "I mean, working with your hands, being outside, it's so authentic, so real." She spoke as if authenticity were a charming eccentricity rather than a virtue, something quaint that people like Jamal possessed because they hadn't evolved beyond it yet. The conversation moved on quickly, as if they'd fulfilled their obligation to acknowledge his existence and could now return to discussing things that actually mattered: portfolio management, client acquisitions, and the kind of problems that came with having too much money rather than too little. Naya seemed to glow under their attention, especially when the conversation turned to her recent success in securing several high-net-worth clients. "I've always been conservative about risk management," she said, glancing meaningfully at Jamal. "That's why I insisted on the prenup. Smart protection for both parties involved." Her friends murmured approval, treating her caution as evidence of her business acumen rather than a personal slight. One of them even complimented her on being practical about love, as if romance were just another asset class that needed proper diversification to minimize exposure. Jamal listened to it all without protest, his expression neutral as they discussed his marriage, like a merger that needed the right safeguards to protect the more valuable party. When Marcus made a joke about Naya being the provider in the relationship, everyone laughed, including Naya herself, who seemed to find the observation both accurate and amusing. Nobody asked Jamal what he thought about being discussed in the third person while sitting right there, and he didn't offer his opinion. Instead, he excused himself politely, mentioning something about an early morning appointment, and made a mental note to call his own lawyer first thing Monday. As they walked to the parking garage afterward, Naya was still glowing from the evening's validation. "Wasn't that fun? I love how welcoming everyone was to you." She seemed genuinely pleased, as if she'd successfully introduced him to important people rather than subjected him to an evening of polite condescension. "And you handled yourself really well. Very dignified." The word came out like praise for a pet that had performed tricks without embarrassing itself, and Jamal realized that in her mind, that's exactly what had happened. He'd been a good sport about his place in their hierarchy, and she was proud of him for it. "I made an appointment to review the prenup with my own attorney," Jamal said as they reached their cars, his voice casual but firm. Naya's smile flickered, just for a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to take any independent action at all. "Just to make sure I understand everything I signed." The lawyer had been surprised by his call too, especially when Jamal mentioned some of the more unusual clauses. "Are you sure you want to leave this provision in there?" the man had asked, his tone suggesting that most people would have fought harder for themselves. But Jamal had a different strategy in mind. The morning air carried the scent of dew and possibility as Jamal walked to the mailbox, coffee mug in hand, and his work boots already laced for another day. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, with most residents still wrapped in their morning routines, unaware that their landscaper was about to receive news that would shift everything. Nestled between a credit card offer and the electric bill was an envelope that made his pulse quicken. Thick, cream-colored paper with the distinctive letterhead of Wellington and Associates Trust Attorneys. He opened it carefully, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle with the expensive stationery. The letter was brief but loaded with implications. "Final review in progress," it read in formal legal language. "We require your confirmation on the remaining ethical compliance conditions before proceeding with trust activation. Please confirm your current marital status and any prenuptial agreements that may affect distribution protocols." The words were clinical, professional, but they represented a turning point that would change everything about his marriage and his wife's understanding of who she'd actually bound herself to. Jamal folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his expression thoughtful as he considered the timing. He'd been waiting for this correspondence for 3 months, ever since his grandmother's estate had finally worked its way through the complex web of family trusts and legal requirements. The lawyers had been thorough about ensuring that any beneficiary met the character standards built into the trust generations ago. Integrity, humility, and genuine partnership in marriage were all conditions that had seemed quaint until they became the gatekeepers to generational wealth. The front door opened behind him, and Naya appeared on the porch, wrapped in her silk robe and checking her phone for overnight emails from clients. "Anything interesting?" she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes sharp as they fixed on the expensive envelope in his hands. There was something about the quality of the paper, the formal topography of the return address, that triggered her professional instincts. In her world, correspondence like this usually meant money, and money always meant opportunity or threat. Her gaze lingered on the logo longer than necessary, as if trying to place where she'd seen it before. "Just some legal paperwork," Jamal replied, his voice carefully neutral as he tucked the envelope away. He could see the wheels turning behind her eyes, the way she processed information like a computer calculating risk and reward. Wellington and Associates wasn't a firm that handled small matters. They were the kind of attorneys who managed old family wealth, charging more per hour than most people made in a month. Nothing that affects us directly. The lie came easily, not because he wanted to deceive her, but because he needed to see who she really was when she thought he had nothing to offer. Nia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she processed his response, clearly unsatisfied with such a dismissive answer about correspondence from such an expensive firm. "Legal paperwork can be tricky," she said, stepping closer with casual interest. "If you need help understanding it, you know I deal with estate planning and trust management all the time." Her offer was wrapped in helpfulness, but there was something predatory in her tone, like a shark that had caught the scent of blood but couldn't locate its source. "I appreciate that," Jamal said, meeting her gaze directly, "but I think I can handle it." There was something in his voice that made her pause, a quiet confidence she wasn't accustomed to hearing from him. For just a moment, the dynamic between them shifted, and she found herself looking at him as if seeing a stranger. "Just routine correspondence," he added with a slight smile that revealed nothing at all. The dining room at Naya's parents' house carried the weight of middle-class success. Polished mahogany furniture, family photos in expensive frames, and the subtle scent of prosperity that came from years of careful financial planning. Jamal sat across from his in-laws, cutting through perfectly seasoned roast beef while navigating conversation that felt like a minefield wrapped in Southern hospitality. Margaret Griffin had set the table with her best china, the kind reserved for special occasions and guests who needed to be impressed, though Jamal suspected he fell into a different category entirely. "You know, Jamal," Margaret began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd perfected the art of polite condescension, "you really lucked out when you met our Naya. I mean, a woman like her, educated, successful, financially independent, she could have had anyone." She smiled as she spoke, as if offering him a compliment rather than reminding him of his place in their family hierarchy. Her husband nodded in agreement, raising his wine glass in what might have been a toast if it hadn't felt more like a gentle warning about maintaining proper gratitude for his good fortune. "A man's got to provide," Robert Griffin added, his tone carrying the authority of someone who'd built his own modest empire through decades of disciplined work. "That's what we do. We take care of our families, make sure that you're secure, build something lasting." He gestured around the room as if to illustrate his point, then looked directly at Jamal with the kind of expectation that suggested he was waiting for acknowledgement of wisdom shared. "Now I know times are changing, and there's nothing wrong with different arrangements. But a woman like Naya, she needs security, real security, not just good intentions." Naya sat beside Jamal, her hand occasionally touching his arm in what appeared to be supportive gestures, but felt more like claims of ownership. When the conversation turned to their recent marriage, she smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd made a sound investment. "That's why we did the prenup," she said, her voice carrying a note of pride that made Jamal's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "I learned from the best about protecting what you've worked for." Her parents exchanged approving glances, clearly pleased that their daughter had inherited their practical approach to love and money. The conversation continued around him with occasional questions directed his way that felt more like pop quizzes than genuine interest in his thoughts. They discussed Naya's latest client acquisitions, her expanding practice, and her plans for building generational wealth with the casual confidence of people who'd never doubted their place in the world's hierarchy. Jamal answered when spoken to, his responses polite but increasingly detached, as if he were watching the evening from somewhere outside himself. Each comment reinforced the same message. He was the fortunate recipient of Naya's generosity, not her equal partner. As dessert was served, Jamal made his decision with the same quiet determination he brought to transforming neglected landscapes into something beautiful. He would give Naya exactly what she wanted, a husband who knew his place, who accepted the boundaries she'd drawn around their relationship, who signed documents without complaint. But he would also give her something else, something she hadn't anticipated when she crafted her perfect prenuptial protection. Tomorrow he would ask her to sign an additional page, something that would test whether her commitment to legal thoroughness extended to agreements that didn't exclusively favor her interests. "Tomorrow I'd like you to sign one more page," he said quietly as they prepared to leave, his tone casual enough that it took a moment for the words to register. Naya's smile flickered with confusion, then quickly reformed itself around the assumption that whatever he wanted would be as inconsequential as everything else about him. But there was something in his eyes that suggested she might have miscalculated somewhere along the way. The house felt different when Jamal walked through the front door that evening, as if someone had adjusted the lighting to cast everything in a softer glow. Naya appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron he'd never seen before, flour dusting her hands and a smile that seemed unusually warm. The scent of his favorite meal, herb-crusted chicken with roasted vegetables, filled the air, and she moved toward him with the kind of graceful attention she usually reserved for important clients. Something had shifted in her approach, and Jamal recognized the calculated nature of her sudden domesticity, even as he appreciated the effort behind it. "I thought we could have a quiet dinner together," she said, reaching up to loosen his work shirt collar with fingers that lingered longer than necessary. "Just us, no distractions. I realize we haven't really talked in weeks, not about anything important." Her voice carried a vulnerability that felt both genuine and strategic, as if she'd discovered that honey might work better than vinegar in managing their relationship dynamics. She guided him to the couch, bringing him a beer she'd apparently chilled specifically for his arrival, and settled beside him with the focused attention of someone conducting an interview disguised as intimacy. The questions came gradually, woven into conversation about his day and his work, but Jamal could feel her fishing for information with professional skill. She asked about his family background, his childhood, whether he had ever had opportunities he hadn't pursued. "I sometimes feel like I don't know everything about you," she said with a laugh that was meant to sound affectionate but carried undertones of frustration. "Like there might be parts of your story I haven't heard yet." Her hand rested on his arm as she spoke, and her eyes searched his face with the intensity of someone who'd caught a scent she couldn't quite identify. Jamal answered her questions with the same careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout their relationship, sharing just enough to seem open without revealing anything substantial. He told her about growing up with his grandmother, about learning the value of honest work, about finding satisfaction in creating beauty from neglected spaces. But he didn't mention the stories his grandmother had told him about family money, about trusts and responsibilities that would someday fall to him, about the importance of character and relationships built to last. Those conversations belonged to a different version of himself, one that Naya hadn't shown any interest in knowing. After dinner, as they reviewed the additional page he'd requested, Jamal watched her read through his proposed addendum with the careful attention of someone checking fine print for hidden traps. The language was simple, straightforward: mutual respect, open communication, shared decision-making in matters affecting both parties. Nothing that would threaten her financial security, but everything that would establish him as an equal partner, rather than a fortunate beneficiary of her generosity. "This seems unnecessary," she said finally, her tone suggesting that emotional clauses had no place in their practical arrangement. But as she read further, Jamal noticed her pause at a section she'd added to the original prenup, a clause about future assets remaining separate property. He'd insisted on keeping that particular provision exactly as she'd written it, despite his lawyer's surprise at the decision. Now, watching her reread her own words, he could see the moment when she realized the potential implications. "You want to keep this part about future assets?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Even though it might limit certain protections for you? Jamal nodded, his expression calm and decisive. Keep it exactly as you wrote it. That clause is perfectly fair. There was something in his tone that made her study his face more carefully, searching for clues about what might be driving his unusual insistence on maintaining a provision that seemed to work entirely in her favor. For just a moment, she looked like someone who'd realized she might have missed something important in her calculations. But the feeling passed quickly, replaced by relief that he was making her life easier rather than more complicated. She signed the additional page without further argument, unaware that she'd just agreed to the very boundaries that would define their future in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The conference room at Wellington and Associates occupied an entire corner of the 40th floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that spoke of the kind of money that bought perspective on the world below. Jamal sat at the polished mahogany table across from Charles Wellington himself, a man whose family had been managing generational wealth since before the Civil War. Naya sat beside her husband, her professional composure intact despite the obvious questions racing through her mind about why she'd been specifically invited to attend this meeting. The leather portfolio in front of the attorney contained documents that would reshape everything she thought she knew about the man she'd married. Mr. Porter, Wellington began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. The final conditions of your grandmother's trust have been satisfied. Your character assessment, completed through our standard evaluation process, confirms your eligibility for full inheritance. He opened the portfolio with practiced precision, revealing documents that bore official seals and signatures from judges who specialized in probate matters involving substantial assets. The trust, established by your great-great-grandfather in 1892, contains liquid assets totaling $200 million, plus additional real estate holdings and investment portfolios managed by our firm. The words hit the room like a physical force, and Jamal felt Naya's entire body go rigid beside him. Her hand, which had been resting casually on the table, now gripped the edge with enough force to whiten her knuckles. $200 million, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she struggled to process information that contradicted everything she'd believed about their financial dynamic. Her eyes moved frantically between Jamal and the attorney, searching for some indication that this was a mistake, a case of mistaken identity, anything that would make sense of the impossible situation unfolding in front of her. Wellington continued with the methodical precision of someone who'd delivered similar news countless times before. The trust comes with specific behavioral conditions designed to preserve family values across generations. Recipients must demonstrate integrity, humility, and commitment to genuine partnership in marriage. He glanced meaningfully at Naya before continuing. Any attempt to manipulate, coerce, or financially exploit the beneficiary results in immediate forfeiture of access to trust assets. These safeguards were built into the original documentation to ensure that inherited wealth serves to strengthen rather than corrupt family relationships. Jamal signed the acceptance documents with the same steady hand he'd used to sign the prenup, his expression calm despite the magnitude of what was happening. This was the moment he'd been preparing for since receiving that first letter, the culmination of months of legal review and character assessment that had taken place entirely outside Naya's awareness. She watched him write his name as if he were signing documents for a landscaping contract rather than accepting an inheritance that dwarfed her own net worth by orders of magnitude. We'll need copies of any existing prenuptial agreements for our records, Wellington added, his tone suggesting this was routine procedure rather than the bombshell it actually represented. We can absolutely modify our prenup, Naya said suddenly, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm, as reality began to settle in round her. I mean, circumstances have changed significantly, haven't they? We're a team, a partnership. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. She reached for Jamal's hand with the kind of desperate affection she'd never shown before. Her entire demeanor transformed from controlling benefactor to eager collaborator in the span of 5 minutes. Her professional training in asset management was already calculating new strategies, new approaches to securing her position in their suddenly redefined relationship. Jamal looked at her directly, his voice quiet but absolutely firm. That won't be necessary. The prenup works perfectly as written. He could see the confusion in her eyes, The growing realization that the man she'd thought she understood had just revealed himself to be someone entirely different. The document she'd crafted to protect herself from his poverty would now protect his wealth from her ambition. And the irony wasn't lost on either of them as they sat in that room overlooking a city where money changed everything, especially the people who thought they already understood how the game was played. The living room had been transformed into a war room of aspiration, with real estate brochures fanned across the coffee table and luxury property listings displayed on Naya's laptop. She'd spent the morning researching mansions, country clubs, and investment opportunities that would announce their newfound status to everyone who mattered. Her phone buzzed constantly with congratulations from colleagues who'd heard whispers about the inheritance through the professional network that connected wealth managers across the city. "We need to think strategically," she said, spreading photographs of Hampton houses across the table with the enthusiasm of a general planning a campaign. The right property, the right club memberships, the right social circles. People need to see that we belong in these environments. Each image represented another step up the ladder she'd been climbing her entire career, and her excitement was palpable as she outlined their path to social elevation. Jamal sat quietly in his work clothes, dirt still under his fingernails from the morning's landscaping jobs, watching his wife orchestrate their future without asking for his input. "I'm not changing anything about my business," he said finally, his voice cutting through her enthusiasm. "I like what I do. I'm good at it. The money doesn't change that." Her expression shifted from excitement to confusion, as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "But you could do anything now," she insisted, leaning forward with intensity. "You could invest, start a real company, build something significant. Why choose to keep working with your hands when you could be working with your mind?" The condescension was unconscious but unmistakable, revealing assumptions about manual labor that ran deeper than professional courtesy. In her world, wealth meant elevation away from physical work, not subsidizing your choice to continue it. The conversation escalated as Naya outlined her vision for their transformed life: publicity, charitable galas for networking, business ventures to multiply their assets. When Jamal reminded her about their mutual respect agreement, she waved it away dismissively. "That was before. Everything's different now. You have responsibilities that come with this kind of money." Her tone suggested legal documents were suggestions rather than binding commitments. "The only responsibility I have," Jamal replied steadily, "is to remain the person who deserved this inheritance in the first place." He could see her processing his words, searching for the angle that would give her control over decisions she'd assumed would naturally fall to her financial expertise. But the trust's behavioral conditions weren't suggestions, and neither were the boundaries he'd established. Naya's frustration finally broke through her professional composure. "You're being selfish. This isn't just about you anymore. We're partners, and partners make decisions together." But even as she spoke, they both knew she wasn't talking about partnership. She was talking about control. The inheritance had shifted their power dynamic, and she couldn't accept that the man she'd considered financially dependent was now beyond her influence. "You're not afraid I'm poor," Jamal said quietly, watching her face as the truth settled between them. "You're afraid I'm not controllable anymore." The law office felt different this time, charged with the tension of a woman who'd discovered that legal documents worked both ways. Naya sat rigidly in the leather chair beside her newly hired attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Coleman, who specialized in matrimonial law and asset protection. The mahogany table was covered with copies of the prenuptial agreement, trust documentation, and legal precedents that Patricia had researched in preparation for what she clearly believed would be a straightforward case of contract modification. The confidence in the room belonged entirely to the wrong people. "The circumstances have changed substantially since the original agreement was signed," Patricia began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd successfully challenged dozens of prenups in her career. "My client entered into this contract under the reasonable assumption that she was the primary asset holder in the marriage. The discovery of a $200 million inheritance fundamentally alters the financial landscape and provides clear grounds for modification based on material misrepresentation." She gestured toward the trust documents as if they were evidence of fraud rather than family legacy. Wellington reviewed the prenup with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen every variation of marital contract manipulation in his 40-year career. The future assets clause is quite explicit, he said, pointing to the section Naya had insisted on including. All assets acquired after the marriage date remain the separate property of the acquiring spouse. This language was added at Mrs. Porter's specific request and applies equally to both parties regardless of the source or magnitude of those assets. His finger traced the relevant text as if highlighting a particularly elegant piece of legal craftsmanship. The blood drained from Naya's face as the implications settled over her like a cold fog. The clause she'd written to protect her own assets from any potential claims by her seemingly poor husband now locked her completely out of the largest inheritance she'd ever encountered. But that was meant to protect my practice, my investments, she said, her voice rising with desperation. I couldn't have known about this inheritance. He deliberately concealed material information that would have affected my decision-making. Her professional composure cracked as she realized that every legal strategy she'd employed to secure her advantage had become the mechanism of her exclusion. The trust requires complete transparency in marital relationships, Wellington continued implacably. Any attempt to coerce, manipulate, or pressure the beneficiary regarding asset distribution triggers immediate protective protocols. The prenuptial agreement, as written and signed by both parties, actually serves as additional protection for the trust's integrity. He closed the file with finality that sounded like a gavel falling. The behavioral conditions built into the inheritance specifically anticipate situations like this. Naya turned to Jamal with tears of frustration and rage building in her eyes. You set this up. You knew exactly what you were doing when you signed that agreement. You manipulated me into writing my own exclusion. Her accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire she'd unknowingly set herself. The woman who'd built her career on understanding financial leverage had been outmaneuvered by the man she'd considered intellectually and professionally inferior. How long have you known about this money? I didn't manipulate you into anything, Jamal replied, his voice steady despite the emotional storm breaking around him. You wrote every word of that prenup based on your own assumptions about who I was and what I was worth. You insisted on protecting your assets from my poverty. Now it protects my inheritance from your ambition. He looked directly at her, his expression neither angry nor triumphant, just profoundly sad. The prenup isn't punishing you, Naya. It's showing you exactly who you chose to be. Patricia gathered her papers with the defeated efficiency of someone recognizing an unwinnable case. The prenup was ironclad, the trust was bulletproof, and her client had literally authored her own exclusion from the wealth she discovered too late. Are you planning to leave me? Naya whispered, her voice small and desperate as the full scope of her miscalculation became clear. I'm planning to save myself first, Jamal answered quietly. Then we'll see if there's anything left worth saving. The living room felt smaller in the quiet evening light, stripped of the tension that had dominated their house for weeks. Naya sat curled in the corner of the sofa, her professional armor completely abandoned in favor of vulnerability that seemed both genuine and calculated. She'd been crying. Her makeup was smudged, and her usual perfect composure had cracked to reveal something that might have been real remorse. Jamal sat across from her in the armchair he'd claimed as his own, his work boots placed neatly beside the door and his expression carefully neutral as he waited for her to find the words she'd been searching for all day. I'm scared, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared of losing everything, of being nothing, of watching you walk away and knowing I destroyed the only real thing I had. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it surprised him, as if she'd discovered emotions she didn't know she possessed. I built my whole life around being successful, around winning, around never being vulnerable. And then you came along and made me feel safe enough to let my guard down, except I never actually did. I just found new ways to stay in control. Jamal listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap as she worked through confessions that sounded like therapy sessions she'd never attended. The woman who'd managed millions of dollars in assets for her clients couldn't manage her own emotional portfolio, couldn't calculate the cost of treating her husband like a liability instead of a partner. The prenup wasn't about protecting my money, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in honesty. It was about protecting myself from having to trust you completely, from having to admit that I loved you more than I loved winning. Here's what's going to happen, Jamal said when her words finally ran out. We're going to try a 90-day separation. You're going to find a marriage counselor, and we're both going to attend sessions twice a week. During that time, we'll see if you can learn to treat me like an equal instead of a project. His tone was matter-of-fact, businesslike, as if he were negotiating a landscaping contract rather than the terms of their marriage. No shared finances during the separation, no attempts to influence my business decisions or my relationship with the trust. No discussions about my money except in counseling sessions. Naya's eyes widened as she realized he wasn't offering reconciliation. He was offering rehabilitation. What if I can't? What if I mess this up again? Her question carried the fear of someone who'd built her identity around competence and was being asked to admit fundamental failure. The thought of starting over, of learning to be vulnerable in a relationship she'd approached like a merger, seemed almost impossible. But the alternative was losing the only man who'd ever seen through her success to the person she might become if she stopped trying to win every conversation. Then we'll know we tried, Jamal replied simply. But Naya, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the money, and it's not about punishment. This is about learning whether you can love someone without trying to control them, whether you can be married to someone you can't manage. He stood up, his decision clearly made regardless of her response. If you can't sign a commitment to treat me with basic respect, then don't sign anything else either. Because I won't live the rest of my life being grateful for scraps from someone who's supposed to be my partner. The charity gala at the Metropolitan Club buzzed with the kind of energy that only accompanied serious money and serious networking. Jamal stood near the silent auction tables in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, watching the same people who'd treated him like invisible help 6 months ago now approach with the desperate enthusiasm of salespeople sensing commission. Word of the inheritance had spread through the city's financial circles with the speed of insider trading, and suddenly everyone wanted to reminisce about conversations they'd never had and friendships they'd never pursued. The transformation was as predictable as it was pathetic. "Jamal, there you are," Marcus called out, extending his hand with the warmth of a long-lost brother rather than someone who'd spent an entire dinner discussing him in the third person. "I was just telling Patricia here about your incredible business instincts. The way you've been building your landscaping operation, so methodical, so strategic. Classic old money approach to wealth building." His smile was bright enough to power the chandelier above them, and his handshake lingered with the desperation of someone who'd realized he'd misjudged a potential client worth $200 million. Across the room, Naya stood in a circle of her former admirers, watching her social capital evaporate in real time. The same colleagues who'd congratulated her on her practical approach to love were now asking pointed questions about her prenuptial strategy and whether she'd properly advised herself on asset protection. Elena, who'd praised Jamal's authenticity with such condescending sweetness, now avoided eye contact entirely, apparently having discovered that authentic people sometimes possessed more substantial assets than people who merely talked about authenticity professionally. "The landscaping business must be incredibly profitable," Patricia observed to Jamal, her tone suggesting she'd completely forgotten describing his work as quaint just months earlier. "I mean, to build that kind of wealth through such traditional means. It's inspiring, really, so American." She laughed nervously, apparently hoping he wouldn't remember her previous comments about people who worked with their hands. The irony wasn't lost on anyone within earshot that the woman who managed investment portfolios for a living was now trying to flatter someone whose inheritance dwarfed her entire client base. Jamal accepted their sudden attention with the same quiet grace he'd shown their previous dismissal, neither embracing their newfound enthusiasm nor rejecting it outright. He answered their questions politely, shared appropriate small talk, and treated them with more courtesy than they'd ever shown him when they thought he was merely Nia's financially dependent husband. His dignity in the face of their transparent opportunism only highlighted the hollowness of their social performance, making their desperation more obvious with every forced laugh and manufactured memory. The evening's cruelest moment came when Margaret Griffin approached Naya with the same maternal concern she'd once reserved for guiding her daughter toward better choices. "Sweetheart, I hope you're taking care of yourself through all this adjustment," she said, her voice carrying the sympathy typically reserved for people facing terminal diagnoses. "Marriage is so complicated when circumstances change unexpectedly. You just have to remember that some things are more important than others." The words were kind, but the underlying message was clear. Naya had gambled on the wrong horse and lost spectacularly. As the evening wound down, Naya found herself standing alone by the bar, watching her husband navigate conversations with people who'd never given him a second thought when he was just the landscaper she'd married. The loneliness was crushing, made worse by the realization that the one person in the room who wasn't treating her differently based on changed financial circumstances was the man she'd spent months systematically diminishing. "If I can't win," she whispered to herself, not realizing Jamal had approached close enough to hear, "Do you still choose me?" The question hung between them like a prayer she wasn't sure she deserved to have answered. The morning light filtered through their bedroom curtains with unusual gentleness, casting soft shadows across a room that had become a battlefield over the past month. Naya sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap like a penitent, seeking absolution she wasn't sure she deserved. The expensive skincare routine and designer pajamas couldn't hide the exhaustion in her eyes or the weight she'd lost from sleepless nights spent confronting the reality of who she'd become in their marriage. Jamal stood by the window, still in his work clothes from an early morning job, waiting to see if the woman he'd married could finally emerge from behind the professional mask she wore like armor. "I cut ties with Marcus and Elena yesterday," she said quietly, her voice lacking the confidence that had once defined every conversation. "Called them both and told them I wouldn't be joining their networking group anymore, wouldn't be attending their dinners, wouldn't be participating in any more conversations where people get evaluated based on their bank statements." The admission seemed to surprise her, as if she'd discovered she was capable of choosing principles over profit. "I also called your mother-in-law and apologized for the dinner at my parents' house, for not defending you, for letting them make you feel small." Jamal turned from the window but didn't move closer, his expression carefully neutral as he listened to confessions that sounded like someone learning a foreign language. "I wrote up a behavioral agreement," Naya continued, pulling a document from her nightstand drawer. "No financial discussions without your explicit consent. No attempts to influence your business decisions. No references to your work as anything less than honorable." Her hands shook slightly as she held the papers, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain about her next move. The document was surprisingly thorough, written in plain language rather than legal jargon, outlining specific behaviors she would avoid and concrete actions she would take to rebuild trust. "This isn't about the money," she said, echoing words he'd spoken to her weeks earlier. "This is about learning to love someone without trying to manage them, without needing to be superior to them, without treating partnership like a hostile takeover." Her voice cracked on the last words, revealing depths of self-awareness that had apparently been buried under years of professional success and social climbing. Jamal accepted the document but didn't read it immediately, his attention focused entirely on her face as he searched for signs of genuine transformation versus strategic performance. "I need to see consistent actions over time," he said finally. "Words are easy, Niamaya. Habits are hard. Respect isn't something you can schedule like a business meeting." His tone was neither harsh nor encouraging, simply honest in the way that had always made her uncomfortable, because it demanded the same honesty in return. "I'll watch what you do in the coming weeks." The balcony overlooked a city that never slept, its lights stretching toward horizons that promised endless possibilities for those brave enough to claim them. Jamal stood alone in the cool evening air, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had grown cold while he contemplated decisions that would define the rest of his life. The inheritance document sat on the table behind him, officially processed and legally binding, but the real wealth he'd gained wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in clarity about who he was and what he deserved from the people who claimed to love him. Naya appeared in the doorway, hesitant and uncertain in a way that would have seemed impossible months earlier. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her voice carrying none of the authority that had once defined every conversation between them. "About learning to love without controlling, about being a partner instead of a manager. I think I understand now why the money scared me so much. It wasn't about losing control of you. It was about losing the excuse to avoid being vulnerable myself." Her honesty was raw, unpolished by professional training or social expectations. "Here's what happens next," Jamal said, turning to face her with the calm determination of someone who'd found his boundaries and intended to maintain them. 90 days of separation like we discussed. Marriage counseling twice a week, no exceptions. During that time, you demonstrate through actions, not words, that you can treat me as an equal partner rather than a project to be managed. His voice carried no anger, no desire for revenge, just the quiet strength of a man who'd learned to value himself appropriately. The terms were non-negotiable, presented with the same straightforward honesty he brought to every aspect of his life. No shared finances during the separation, no attempts to influence his relationship with the trust or his business decisions. No discussions about the inheritance outside of supervised counseling sessions. If you can prove that you want a marriage instead of a merger, he continued, then we'll talk about what comes next. If you can't, then we'll have our answer about whether this relationship was ever real or just convenient. Naya nodded slowly, her acceptance carrying the weight of someone who'd finally understood the stakes involved. The woman who'd built her career on winning had to learn how to surrender control in order to gain something more valuable than victory. "And if I fail?" she asked quietly, her voice small in the vast night air. "Then you'll know you tried," Jamal replied, echoing words that had become his mantra throughout their crisis. The city lights twinkled below them like scattered diamonds, each one representing someone else's dreams and struggles and choices about who to become when faced with difficult truths. Jamal had chosen dignity over revenge, boundaries over bitterness, and the possibility of real partnership over the certainty of comfortable loneliness. The door to their future remained open, but the terms of entry had fundamentally changed. He wasn't choosing to punish her. He was choosing to save himself first, then seeing if there was anything left worth rebuilding together. True strength isn't about having power over others. It's about knowing your own worth and refusing to settle for less than you deserve. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, believe them, but also remember that people can choose to change if they're willing to do the real work. Love without respect isn't love at all. It's just convenience wrapped in pretty words. What would you have done in Jamal's position? Would you have chosen forgiveness or walked away completely? Hit that like button if this story reminded you that your dignity is never negotiable. And we'll see you in the next video for another story that proves karma always finds a way.